The following interview is with Dr. Wendy Whitman Cobb. Dr. Whitman Cobb is a graduate of the University of Central Florida and University of Florida, where she has acquired 2 master's degrees and a PhD in political science. She has authored multiple books on political science and recently has published a book on reducing conflicts in space. Dr. Whitman Cobb works as an associate professor of strategy and strategic studies at the U.S. Air Force School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. Dr. Whitman Cobb has stated that any views displayed in this interview are hers and not reflective of the Department of Defense, Air University, the Air Force, or any of its affiliates. She now joins the Generations interviewer Catherine for an interview on the militarization of space. This series is promoting the charity Tab for a Cause. If you're interested in supporting solutions to international issues with a simple Chrome extension, please click the link in the video description.
Hello and welcome back to Worldview's interview series. I'm Alethea and I am here today with Professor Whitman Cobb, who is speaking with us on space warfare for our episode related to it. The full documentary episode will be listed in the description of this video. So my first question for you today is, can you define or give us a little bit of insight as to what the weaponization of space means?
So space weaponization is a really interesting topic, and it's quite distinct from what we refer to as space militarization. So space has always been militarized in the sense that we use it for a military purpose. Ever since Sputnik went up, it's been militarized. We use it for military communications, remote imaging, missile warning, all of those things. So space is militarized, but to this point, at least as far as we all know, space has not been weaponized in the sense that active weapons have been placed in Earth orbit. So that would be just the basic definition of space weaponization. Now, part of the problem with that is understanding what a weapon in space is. It's not entirely clear because it really is sort of in the intent. When the space shuttle was being built in the 1970s, the Soviet government was actually concerned that it was an anti-satellite weapon because it had the Canadarm in it. And that Canadarm could have been used to grab onto a Soviet satellite and destroy it. So we call this the dual use nature of space, in that things that seem peaceful or non-aggressive in its purposes could actually be used in a more aggressive, weaponized way. And so because a lot of the space assets are dual use, it's very difficult sometimes to tell whether something is a weapon or isn't. It isn't a weapon, and it's often in the eye of the beholder.
All right, so to that end, you obviously sort of touched on this in that question, but when would you say the weaponization of space really began, if you can pinpoint that?
As far as we know publicly, it hasn't. The only recently has the Department of Defense and our Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, kind of said that China and Russia have begun to weaponize space. But in terms of out in the open, what we know in the public domain, I've seen no evidence that weapons have actively been placed in space. I have no access to classified documents. I don't know what I don't know. But in terms of open source, what's publicly available, I'm not convinced that weapons are in space. That doesn't mean that things that aren't up there now could be used as a weapon. You can collide one satellite with another satellite. But to my knowledge, it has not been weaponized.
All right, thank you. So obviously space is an important economic and military zone for a lot of countries, especially for the United States. What are the most important economic markets that space provides or supports?
Space is such a foundational aspect to our global economy that it's really hard to put a finger on exactly all it supports. I mean, everything from communications to location, timing services is, I think, probably the thing that's overlooked most. When we talk about GPS, we think about it in terms of location and getting our maps and getting to where we need to go. But one of the other really integral parts of our GPS system is in its timing function. Each GPS satellite has an ultra precise atomic clock on it that transmits precise timing signals to Earth. And these timing signals are used in everything from financial transactions to when you use your credit card at the gas tank, to emergency services and communications. And those timing signals are really important in our global economy. It's just thinking about the financial markets. If you need to time a stock trade and you want to get the best price for your stock sale, you want to make sure you get that trade in at the right time. And those timing signals really help to make that happen. So timing from GPS, location services, communications, all of these things, even just remote imaging. So one of the coolest studies I've seen has been the economic impact of remote imaging from space for farmers in the Midwest. And there's this one study that looked at the economic impact of being able to see and plan and master the territory. That economic impact is in the billions of dollars for just one parcel of land in the Midwest. So weather, knowing what the weather is going to be like, emergency services, emergency planning, the economic impact of space is incredibly wide and vast. And because of that, it's very hard to put a precise number on it. But financial, obviously, I think just the basics of our global financial system are based on the space infrastructure that we have.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, what capabilities are countries like the US, China, and Russia looking to build in order to maintain their position as space powers?
So again, I have no access to anything classified, and all my information comes from open source. What I can, from based on that data, we know that Russia, China, the United States are all trying to develop at least defensive systems for satellites, how to guard against electronic warfare. We've seen cases of GPS spoofing, where you think you know where you are, but there's an adversary who's hacking into the system and telling you you're somewhere different. So we've seen cases of GPS spoofing. And we would really term that electronic warfare. So we need to find ways to defend against that. So I'm sure we're developing our own electronic warfare capabilities, our own ability to do that. A couple of other things that we've seen happening are things like lasers that you would aim at a satellite to sort of interrupt it, jamming those sort of satellites. Recently, Russia has had a couple of satellites in orbit that have come very close to our military satellites. And we call that rendezvous and proximity operations, RPOs. And it's not entirely clear what they're doing when they get really close to our satellites. They could be just trying to look at them and see what capabilities are on board, or they could be getting near to actually attack it. That's not entirely clear. The US has been developing the X-37B, the thing that looks like the mini space shuttle, and that has capabilities of staying on orbit for quite some time. I think the longest it's been up on orbit is over a year at this point. So things of getting those satellites up there. So RPOs are things that all three of the countries have been, I think, looking at. The US has been looking at ways of extending the life of satellites. Satellites, once you get it up there, you still need to have fuel on board to maneuver satellites, either out of the way of different debris or into different orbits. So finding ways to refuel those satellites is actually a pretty important capability to have, just to extend the life, because these things are really expensive and take a really long time to develop. So just being able to refuel them so we can keep using them is an important capability. So I think of course, all three countries have active anti-satellite programs. So these can be as basic as shooting a rocket or a missile from the ground to hit a satellite. In 2007, China had their big ASAT test that created a huge cloud of debris, which is still on orbit, is incredibly dangerous. The United States responded in 2008 with another ASAT test. Russia has, for a long time, had ASAT weapons as well. Both the United States and Russia tested them in the 1960s. So they are developing a new generation of ASAT weapons. So we're all kind of, I think, pursuing some of the same capabilities. To what extent development has been successful and to what extent that's been deployed, it's very hard to say at this point.
Okay, thank you. So since space is important economically and militarily, what treaties are in place that really regulate what states can or can't do in outer space?
Unfortunately, not a lot. The biggest one is the Outer Space Treaty, which was signed in 1967, and it has some very strong points to it. States cannot claim sovereignty over the moon or asteroids or other territory, quote unquote, out in the solar system. It declared space is supposed to be used for peaceful purposes. But if you think about no nuclear weapons, no weapons of mass destruction in space, that's a good thing too. But at the time it was developed and signed, there was very little use of space for anything but military purposes. The economic purposes have only come much, much later. So there's a lot of holes left to fill. So there's the 1967 treaty. There were a couple of other later agreements, including one on aiding astronauts, assisting in their rescue. There was a later treaty called the Moon Treaty that was only signed by a few signatories and not signed on to by the United States or the Soviet Union at the time. So the only real international agreement we have in place is the OST, the Outer Space Treaty. We've tried along the way to come up with some other ones and work through some efforts. The ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, kind of addressed some of these concerns in the 1980s, but obviously we pulled out of it in the early 2000s. Right now, some different codes of conduct are being worked on. The EU has been leading a code of conduct effort. Both Russia and China have proposed bans on space weapons. This week, NASA announced a few months ago, they announced these Artemis Accords, and this week they announced they have 7 signatory countries to it. The Artemis Accords are trying to fill some of that gap in the OST and lay out rules of the road for how we would operate on the moon in terms of lunar exploration. But unfortunately, there are very few rules of the road when it comes to actually operating in Earth orbit, understanding who has right of way, who has to move their satellite, how we allocate resources, who's responsible for debris. All of these very basic things that we need to figure out, there are no international agreements for. So at this point, we're sort of muddling through a lot of these really complicated issues.
Do you think that treaties could end up working? And does there need to be some kind of enforcement mechanism? And if so, how would you enforce them?
I think treaties are needed, and even things short of treaties. I'd be happy with just a couple of multilateral agreements at this point. I'd be happy with something. But you're absolutely right. The enforcement mechanism is always a problem when it comes to international agreements. How do you enforce this? And especially when we're talking about something like outer space or even the moon, where it's expensive to get to in the first place. So the only people who are going to be doing this are really big companies with a lot of money or really well-developed states. And so there's a sort of question about equity also inherent in a lot of this. Because if we're looking at the moon and outer space as a global commons, something that belongs to everybody, and yet only a few people can access it, how can we trust each other to do the right thing? And that's one of the things that's seriously lacking in space is a lack of trust. Part of it is the dual use. We can't trust that people are actually doing the right thing or that they're doing the things that they say they're doing. So there's a lack of trust. And without trust, it's very hard to enforce anything. or even think about enforcement mechanisms. So I think I would be happy with just some sort of code of conduct. I do think actually the commercial space industry might be a way of doing this. Um, a lot of the US American activities in space can't be done without commercial companies. The United States government cannot get into space without SpaceX or United Launch Alliance, which is the other rocket provider. And so if you can't get into space on your own and you're relying on these private companies, well, that might be one way of making sure they do the right thing. You could have private companies come together and say, listen, we're just not going to launch things that we don't like up into space, and you have no other choice. So, I mean, commercial companies might be one way of kind of getting around this process, this problem of enforcement and codes of conduct, because if that's who you need to operate in space, well, if they're not going to do it, you can't do anything. You're going to have to go back to the drawing board and design and build and field your own rockets. And that's a 10 plus year at best endeavor. So I actually think commercial companies might be a way of enforcing some sort of international agreement.
Just as kind of a follow-up to that, do you know if other countries are also relying on commercial companies? I don't know if you'd happen to have that information, but.
So most other countries have, I don't think other countries rely on commercial companies to the extent that we do. China obviously has their own state-owned launch system. India has their own state-owned launch system. The EU, or not the EU, but the European Space Agency that represents most of Europe's space activities, they have Arianespace and the Ariane rocket, which is partially privatized, but it began as a state-owned system as well. So I don't think any of the other major countries that go into space rely on the commercial. I mean, Russia, obviously, theirs is state-owned as well, rely on commercial partners as much as we do. So for us in restraining our activities, it would be a lot more effective. Even still, I mean, Russia's space program has sort of declined in recent years, and China, for all of its advances, and they certainly are advancing, it's still not entirely to the point where we are. So I think there's some room for agreement, and China is certainly trying to get into the commercial space game as well. Russia recently announced a new rocket program that looks suspiciously like SpaceX's Dragon rocket, which is par for the course with the Russians. They built a space shuttle look-alike in the 1980s that looked very much like our space shuttle that only went on test flights, never actually flew operationally. So I think they're aware that they're falling behind in the commercial market, and both of them aware that they're falling behind and trying to catch up. But we have a pretty far head start.
So I think you already touched on this a little bit, but what modern space weapons are currently in play from the major powers, and what future militarization efforts are expected?
I think we're going to see a lot of the trends that we see continue. Again, not privy to any future plans, but I think we're going to see a lot of these things that we're seeing now continue. There's clearly an awareness that space is or the military use of space is fragile. And so I think the concern is how to defend that and defend it in a way that doesn't aggravate mistrust and distrust, which is a classic collective security dilemma. How does one country, how does one person, how does one actor defend itself and build up its defenses so as not to cause fear in another actor? It's a classic international relations dilemma. It's just being played out on the orbital level now. And we haven't always solved it here on Earth. So I still have hope that we can solve it in space. But I think it's going to take some concerted effort and a willingness amongst states to settle the rules of the road. Because if the biggest fear always is, let's say one country attacks another satellite, And that might give you a momentary advantage. But what happens to all the debris if you hit it kinetically? That debris is going to stay there. It might hit other satellites. It could cause eventually this cascading sort of collision. The movie Gravity, it's obviously, a little bit, the drama is heightened for Hollywood's sake, but that fear of a cascading collision is very real. And if all of a sudden you destroy the orbital environment, you might destroy it to the point that you yourself will never be able to use it again. And so it's a really big fear is, do you sacrifice short-term gain in further militarizing and even weaponizing space? Do you sacrifice that short-term gain for the long-term stability of knowing that space is going to be there and space is stable and provides a measure of stability and operational capability that you might lose if we continue down this path?
So, kind of on the same line, what do we know currently about the U.S. Space Force and its current goals for its military capability?
So the Space Force has been exciting. I mean, it's I guess next month it'll be a year since the National Defense Authorization Act was signed and which established the Space Force. They obviously have a lot of organizational work left to do. Um, I know the media and the public often sees these debates about what are we going to call people in the Space Force or what are their uniforms going to look like. And what we know about it, we saw in the Steve Carell show, which was fantastic, but not at all what the actual Space Force is charged with doing. So a lot of their efforts over the past year have been around organization. How are they going to organize themselves? What units will be coming into them? So a couple of the tasks that they're sort of taking on are what we call space domain awareness, which is what it sounds like. We're trying to be aware of what's happening in the space domain. So that's everything from tracking what's up there in orbit, including debris. This week, there's been a couple of near misses between satellites and debris. And so one of the things that they do is they track it. Using satellites in orbit and ground-based radar and telescopes, you got to track every piece that you can up there to make sure it's not going to hit one of our satellites or the International Space Station. So that's one of their important missions. They're sort of also consolidating a lot of the other missions that the Air Force has traditionally had in terms of launches. In terms of space electronic warfare, satellite systems, so GPS systems. So I think a lot of what we've seen over the past year is consolidation and organization. Moving forward, I think the idea is for a lot of that to continue. One of the motivations behind establishing the Space Force was to simplify the space acquisitions process. All of the services do something in space. In fact, the Army actually has a very large presence in space with a lot of satellite communication. They rely on it for a lot of imagery. And so one of the very interesting things is each service acquires space systems independently. And so you see a lot of duplication and wasted effort. And so one of the missions of the Space Forces have been to try and bring that all together, simplify it, find a way to make that process better, because for the military to develop a satellite system, it is often 5 to 7 years. And things move so fast here that you got to be able to decrease that time and move things along faster. So a lot of their efforts this year have also been in terms of working that space acquisitions process to make it simpler, faster, more agile, and more competitive.
So, how is the Space Force different from the U.S. Air Force's space operations?
And so this is something. This is funny. My husband's in the Army, has been for well over a decade now, and I work now for the Air Force for probably about a year and a half, and I still can't. I still have a hard time. So I totally get the difficulty in figuring this out. So a lot of the country's space operations had been up until this past year housed under the Air Force. So with the division of the Space Force, what they did is both the Air Force and the Space Force fall under the Department of the Air Force. So it's kind of like the Marines and the Navy. The Marines fall under the Department of the Navy, but the Navy and the Marines are two separate forces. So basically the same thing is happening here with the Air Force and the Space Force. But there is this other thing called Space Command. So that's, I think, where people often get confused. And you hear these terms like different Central Command, Indo-PACOM, the Indonesia Pacific Command. And what the job of the commands is to actually go out and fight. The job of the services, the Air Force, the Army, the Marines, the Navy, the Space Force, is to train, organize, and equip. So they train all the members, they organize them, they equip them, and then when you need to go fight, they get sent to these different commands, and the commands actually organize the fight. So there's Space Command, which was also stood up again. There used to be a Space Command. It was stood down post 9/11, and now it's back again. So there's the Space Command, whose job it actually is to quote unquote fight in space, whatever that looks like. And then the job of the U.S. Space Force is to train, organize, and equip the military members so that they're ready to get into that fight when the time comes. I hope that makes it simple because, like I said, I still don't get it.
Yeah, that's much clearer. Thank you. So what is your take on the Space Force and its role going forward? And what was President Trump's goals when he established it?
So I'll put my cards on the table. Full disclosure, I wasn't a fan, still not entirely a fan. And I know that's weird coming from somebody who's deeply involved in space issues. And I think part of that is because I also have a background in studying bureaucracy. And bureaucracies have a way of multiplying and growing and making things more complicated. So a couple of the motivations in terms of standing up the Space Force, one was to give primacy to this idea that space is a warfighting domain. Historically, it hasn't always been viewed that way, even though it has been totally militarized from the very beginning. One of the dominant views has been that space should be a sanctuary, that we should all be able to operate there and it should be treated as such. But in the past 10 to 15 years, this idea that space is an active warfighting domain has really taken hold. So I think one of the motivations behind the Space Force is to more firmly establish that we do recognize space as an important warfighting domain. Some of the other motivations were clearly the acquisitions process. And then internally with the Air Force, I think a lot of space operations folks felt they were being given short shrift. The Air Force is dominated by pilots, the fighter jocks. And when you're trying to compete against the fighter jocks for promotions and opportunities and money, space oftentimes lost out. And so by separating them out and giving them their own service, there's not that sort of intense competition that you might have normally seen inside the Air Force. So when the Air Force was established, they have made concerted efforts to say that it's going to be flat, so not as a hierarchical. It's going to be smaller. It's going to be more agile, able to move quicker than some of the other their sister services. But again, I fear bureaucracy grows. So no matter how much you think hierarchy or limiting that is working for now, eventually it will grow. We've known about acquisitions issues for years. The General Accounting Office in Congress has done reports for years on space acquisitions problems in the Department of Defense. Congress has asked DoD on multiple occasions and multiple laws to do something about it, and the DoD has yet to do that. So I'm not entirely convinced that establishing a whole new bureaucracy to simplify the acquisitions process is actually going to work when the DoD has just been reluctant to do it in the first place, even though they've been mandated by Congress to do so. So I think my concerns are organizationally, but also rhetorically. What does our rhetoric about space being a warfighting domain do to perceptions of the U.S. By other countries? If other countries see us talking like this, they have no choice but to perceive space as a warfighting domain as well. And I think that only heightens the mistrust and misperceptions. I think no matter how much we say that we're just defending our own assets in space, they can also say, well, you're planning for a war in space. What do you want us to do? I think it remains to be seen. Space Force has only been around for a year. I've changed my mind on SpaceX. I didn't think SpaceX was going to succeed, and I'm a total convert now. So I'm ready to be proven wrong again.
Kind of on that same note, do we know how the U.S. Space Force compares to China and Russia's equivalent programs, and how well established are China and Russia's equivalent?
So Russia's had a long time had a separate sort of space forces. Russia or China, it's very hard to know. They clearly have the PLA rocket forces. They have a few years ago they did a strategic reorganization into the strategic forces. So clearly there is far more, I think, military or that we know of. Again, it's very hard to see into what they're doing. But I do think there's probably more integration between the civilian and the military aspects of China's space program. And that's, again, one of these things that we saw in this debate over the Space Force is one of the reasons, well, if China is doing this rocket and strategic forces realignment, then we need to do it as well. Again, Russia sort of had, I think, probably something akin to what we've had when the Space Force was part of the Air Force. But now what's actually, I think, really interesting to me is now that we have established a Space Force, a lot of our allied and partner countries are moving to establish their own Space Forces. So France is looking at doing something like that. Australia is looking at doing something like that. I think there has been some talk in the UK of doing it. So I think what's actually more interesting is how our Space Force has triggered the development of Space Forces in our allied and partner countries, because they, again, see the emphasis that we're placing on it and realize they too need to be doing a similar thing.
Sorry. So my next question is, do we have any solid methods of protecting American satellites?
The simple answer is no, we don't. There's ways to make them more resilient in terms of hardening them against electronic warfare, thinking about it in terms of cyber protection so that they can't get hacked into. But the easy answer is no. It always fascinates me because one of my professors, when I was learning this stuff, he goes, a missile is basically a rocket. So if a country has a missile, you can watch the satellite, you can track satellites. Amateur astronomers do it all the time on the internet. And that's one of the ways that we can actually track some of the more secretive things that are happening. There's no stealth in space. So if you know where a satellite's going to be and you have a missile, and that missile has enough power and you aim it in the right spot, boom, you can take it out. And so no, there is no way to protect our assets in space. Do we try through deterrence efforts to deter countries and try to convince them, no, you shouldn't do this? Absolutely. But in terms of active defenses, no, we don't have a good way of doing that.
What were China's presumed motivations when they shut down their own satellite?
So I think part of that is demonstrating that they have that capability. Yeah, and it goes back to deterrence. In order to convince a country not to do something, you have to convince them that you have the power to not to keep them from doing it or to punish them if they do. And so, unless you demonstrate that you have a capability to do something, how's another country going to know that you have it? So I think for them, it was a lot about demonstrating that, hey, we can do this. Same thing for the United States. So the United States response the year later supposedly was to destroy a satellite that was dead, but still had fuel reserves on board. And if it had come back through the atmosphere and landed in the wrong place, it could have been dangerous. So the story, which again, no access to classified information, I think it was a story. That's me. Was that we need to shoot it down to keep it from threatening people on the ground. But I think the real reason was to demonstrate we have a similar capability. Same thing with India. India did an ASAT test last year. And really it's about demonstrating, hey, we can do this. It's about saying to your potential adversaries, if you put the wrong thing up, if you behave the wrong way, we can take you down, and we will take you down.
So my final question is, do you personally feel that military confrontation in space is inevitable? And if so, how might countries best prepare for this both defensively and diplomatically?
This was a subject of my book that I wrote over the summer. I don't think it's inevitable. I continue to believe that if we sit down and do a serious cost benefit analysis of conflict in space, that we will come to realize that the costs of conflict in space are far too high to our global economy. Every country, save for maybe two, Iran and North Korea, are intimately tied into the global economy. And the global economy is predicated on space-based systems. You take down the GPS system, and that's an economic loss of $1 billion a day, with the losses only mounting over time. We think about what COVID's done to our global economy today. Think about what that a GPS going out would do to the global economy over time. It would be tragic. So and that's we lost communications, if we lost that timing ability, it would be immeasurable. And so I think if we actually sat down and thought about this a little bit more, we would realize that engaging in active conflict in outer space has the potential of doing so much damage that could not be contained to one state or the other. It would inevitably spread throughout the global system. And I think the costs are too high for what little benefits would come from knocking out one satellite potentially. So I actually am still hopeful that we can avoid this. I think it's going to take effort. It's going to take compromise. It's going to take time. Trust has to be established amongst Russia, China, and the United States in particular. But it's a process we have to be willing to engage in. And that's where I think is lacking, particularly in the U.S., a lack of willingness to engage in talks about space. Russia and China know their proposals might not be the greatest, and certainly have been self-seeking behavior, but at least they've shown a willingness to engage on these issues. And I think part of the willingness to engage on the United States is a broader public appreciation for the stakes involved. Unfortunately, there just isn't a large amount of public awareness about space, the value it provides to the global economy, and the dangers that are apparent in it. And we can't see it, we can't touch it, we can't feel it. So it becomes a very detached thing. It's more like a video game. So I think we need a greater public awareness of the importance of space to what we do here on the ground, and a greater engagement from the public to force our public officials to more fully engage with the international community on these issues.
Yeah, and hopefully people will watch this episode and then be educated. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for being here and doing this interview. We really appreciate it, and it was absolutely fascinating.
Happy to do it anytime.